My name is Zach Taylor. I am here with none other than Dr. Janina Fisher, world-renowned trauma expert. We're here just popping up on your social feed. Surprise. Many of you, I know, signed up for this. Some of you are just saying, what is this all about? We are here to, first of all, talk to you about borderline personality disorder because Janina has some really interesting ideas about what is going to move us forward as a field when it comes to treating borderline personality, if that's even what we should call it. And number two, Janina is one of our featured speakers at the 45th Annual Psychotherapy Networker Symposium, which is the largest and most, we like to call it the most celebrated gathering of psychotherapists in the world. Janina, you've been speaking at Symposium in Washington, D.C. for how many years, and what has been your experience?
I think it's 10 years now. And my experience is that it's unlike any other conference. There is so much excitement. There's so much energy. Everyone is so impassioned. All the speakers talk about it is the most sophisticated audience, the most curious audience. And it's as much of a joy for us to speak there as I hope it is for the participants.
Sure. We're so happy to have you back. You're going to be doing a couple of workshops. One is on a faster way to treat trauma. Another one is on treating borderline personality, which we're going to talk about right now.
Great.
What do you believe is going on under the hood of borderline personality? And is that even the best name for it? And by the way, those of you hopping on, if you'd like to ask Janina a question, feel free to pop it in the chat. So Janina, what's going on with borderline personality?
Well, we seem to have a sort of field-wide dementia around borderline personality disorder. There is research going back to 1989 that correlates the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder with a history of childhood trauma. And that research has been more consistent than most research is. Those studies have been replicated numerous times. And it's almost as if the field has a blind spot because no one ever remembers that this is clearly a trauma-related diagnosis. So we don't treat borderline personality disorder as a trauma-related disorder. We treat it as a personality disorder. Therapists go out of their way to avoid taking personality disordered clients. No one, there is the stigma attached. It's the diagnosis that no one wants. And so it's demoralizing for the trauma survivors who get that diagnosis.
Mm-hmm. So if borderline personality is really related to a trauma history, why don't all traumatized individuals go on to develop borderline personality? Is it just one of the possible many outcomes of being traumatized? Are there certain risks, certain types of trauma, or certain risk factors that might lead someone to develop these kinds of features that we call borderline personality?
Well, we don't know for sure because you'd have to do prospective research. You'd have to take a group of 20,000 children, follow them from age 1 up, and see how many develop borderline personality disorder. But the research we do have is on young children with quote unquote disorganized attachment, which is the attachment style that has consistently been correlated with trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And if you take that research shows that disorganized attachment at age 1 is a statistical predictor of borderline personality disorder in adulthood.
I see.
So that's one place we can be sure that's a tributary that takes people to that diagnosis.
Right. I mean, there's already a lot of comments. A lot of people came here to hear you talk about this. This is what I love about Psychotherapy Networker is we're really not avoidant of controversy. We are a
Right.
field filled with discussion and debate. That's a lot about what Symposium really is all about. It's to get everybody together, whether you're a counselor, social worker, psychologist, marriage and family therapist, addiction specialist, whatever approach you use, and actually get everybody talking so that we learn. And already, someone's brought up in the chat, is it, they don't think this is always associated with trauma. Is it, are these certain, I guess, symptoms or behaviors always associated with trauma, or is it just a really strong correlation?
Well, if we look at research, there's never such a thing as 100%, right? So whatever we're studying, but the percentage of subjects in these studies who report a history of childhood trauma. We also have research that shows that childhood trauma is underreported. So we might want to factor in that there may be people in the studies and people in our clinical practices who say, oh no, there was no abuse in my childhood. But I always ask them an attachment research associated question. I say, were either of your parents ever frightening? And most say, oh, yeah. And then I ask a follow-up question. When you were young, did either of your parents appear frightened? And many of the borderline clients, or clients, period, who say, oh, no, I wasn't traumatized, answer yes to the frightened and frightening parenting, which is the standard for the attachment research. Because that research shows that disorganized attachment is associated with parents who are frightened. And
so we're not necessarily just talking about those with PTSD. And in fact, you've got some very savvy students in the chat here who said frightened and frightening parenting equals disorganized attachment. And they said, Janina, I learned that from Janina previously. But so we're not just talking about PTSD. We are talking about a type of childhood environment that equaled being frightened and frightening adults, leading to disorganized attachment style, which then might lead to a borderline personality presentation in adulthood. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, well, disorganized attachment is a predictor of borderline personality disorder in adulthood.
Yep.
Not
good.
So I love all this discussion.
Yeah.
And someone raises the question, what about the role of emotional abuse and neglect? And that's where that question about frightened and frightening parenting comes in, because there are some parents who are most emotionally abusive and frightening. And there are some parents who are emotionally abusive and hurtful. But hurtful is different from frightening and overwhelming.
I love that. And, we just popped on your social here, surprise, just to, we wanted to talk about the symposium this year, which is the first time we're back in person in 2 years. We'll be in DC. We'll also be online for those who are not this is the year to make, your choices for yourself, but we'll be completely online broadcasting the same wonderful event there. This year's keynotes, by the way, if you haven't, there's thank you, Rachel, for putting the link up. She's such a good advertiser. The keynotes this year are Russ Momenicum Esther Perel, Emily Nagoski, really famous Kinsey-trained sex researcher. Stephen Hayes, founder of and developer of ACT, really talking about what's next after ACT, which is process-based therapy, which he's super excited to share. I will say Steve Hayes, those of you who know him, said to me, this is my first in-person talk in 2 years, and I'll probably just stand up there grinning the entire time.
Yeah.
And then we'll also have comedian Gary Goldman from HBO there as well. But back to why you all showed up here. Borderline personality. Thank you, Rachel. You already taught us something really important to ask. Were the adults around you frightening, and how did you ask it? How much were you frightened as a child?
So the first question is, when you were growing up, were any of the adults in the family ever frightening? And then when they answer that question, I ask, and when you were young, did any of those adults appear frightened?
Mm-hmm.
Because often it is the frightening parent also frightens the other parent.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the issues that's coming up in the chat is something that I think is worth just mentioning. Someone has talking about a trauma-informed workshop they attended recently, in which the speaker said conclusively, BPD is different from PTSD. And that's absolutely right. The problem is that in the DSM, we don't have enough trauma-related diagnoses. Because remember that DSM is created by very, I'd say very conservative, older, experts or people who are willing to sit on a committee creating the DSM. And they haven't been interested in developing nuanced trauma diagnoses. Mm-hmm. So borderline personality disorder is, in my mind, it's just my opinion, a trauma-related diagnosis. Dissociative identity disorder and dissociative disorder not otherwise specified, complex PTSD. We have lots of different trauma-related diagnoses.
So when you come to Symposium, you're going to be doing a whole workshop on rethinking borderline personality, as well as your other workshop on treating trauma. Mm-hmm. What are some, we have clinicians here who probably have clients this afternoon, maybe that are related to this presentation. Mm-hmm. What are some of the major approaches you've pulled from when you're treating this, what we call borderline personality presentation? What are some of those major approaches that you think speak quite well to the trauma-related nature of these symptoms?
Well, of course, my favorite approach to use is the approach I've developed called trauma-informed stabilization treatment, or TIST, which is a trauma-informed parts approach. Sensory motor psychotherapy is also a very good approach for working with BPD. I would, truthfully, I think most trauma-related disorders are best treated with a variety of different techniques. Right? Even if you're an EMDR therapist, as you know, you have to bring in many different approaches to prepare people for EMDR. Mm-hmm. Most of the BPD clients I've treated were too unstable for EMDR, but not too unstable for sensory motor psychotherapy, and certainly not too unstable for TIST, because as a trauma-informed treatment, it's inherently stabilizing.
What do you think the clients with this borderline personality presentation need the most out of therapy in general? When you've seen really good outcomes and they get better. By the way, first, have you seen people get better from borderline presentation? And what was it that was the change for them that really, I know it's not everybody, but what was the change in general that you see in clients with this presentation that helps lead the path out of these symptoms?
It's very interesting to have you ask that, because if I think about it, the the biggest contributor to their getting better was understanding that they had a trauma-related disorder.
Hmm.
I road tested my TIST model on in a state hospital with, again, the most severe cases of borderline personality that you would ever meet, because these are people who were hospitalized for anywhere from 1 to 10 years because their suicidality was so intense. And the hugest relief for all of them was to understand themselves as traumatized. Oh, I'm not crazy. Oh, I'm not borderline. This is trauma. And they felt a sense of dignity that they don't have when they have a personality disorder. Clear. And when you have borderline personality disorder, you're told repeatedly you're just manipulative and attention seeking. And as my clients have often said to me, when someone calls you manipulative and attention seeking, it makes you want to die even more. So that's the first step. Then it's understanding that those intense responses are triggered. And that gets most of those clients out of the assumptions they otherwise make. When you don't know why you're feeling something, you create a rationale for it. So when they understand, oh, I'm triggered, that's why I'm panicking and afraid I'm going to be abandoned, and I just called my therapist 10 times in the last 5 hours. Probably not a recipe for success in therapy. So it's understanding, oh, I'm triggered. I don't have to panic. I don't have to overreact. I'm just triggered. This rage I'm feeling is just my protector part, trying to defend the hurt child inside me.
It's amazing, as one of the foremost trauma experts in the world, that you say one of the biggest things you've seen change in your clients is just that perspective of going, I'm broken, to something happened to me. And this developed out of I think it was Lisa in the chat who said, out of a sense of survival.
Right.
That's extremely profound. There's a couple questions just in terms of understanding if someone has borderline personality versus maybe something else. What are the defining I'm kind of combining a few questions, but what are some of the defining characteristics of this condition that for now we call borderline personality that you would pick up on first when a client comes to see you?
Well, first, usually what comes up is the intense desire for contact, closeness, and the fear of abandonment. So, and usually that manifests, for example, in difficulty getting from session to session without contact, frequently calling and wanting a call back now that we have texting. Many clients text the therapist. So I start to notice that intense need for contact. I'm already expecting that the protector part, aka the anger, will closely follow.
Mm.
Because, as I say to my clients, therapy and therapists are very triggering, right? We don't mean to be. We try not to be triggering, but inevitably we are.
Mm-hmm.
We're human beings.
Yeah.
Oh,
That's very nice. I mean, we could sit here and go through the DSM, symptom list, but the thing you just brought up, it doesn't really appear in the DSM, and it's such an interesting phenomenon that we might notice. So thank you for bringing up that small nuance. I just want to thank you, Janina, for taking a few minutes to help a field of us therapists out here who are, a lot of us are dealing with a lot of isolation, a lot of what we could call burnout. And it's just so good to feel connected, to be able to have this medium where you can connect with therapists who are doing the great work. And if you all are a bit like me and you're craving that connection, speaking of the need for contact, we
we have COVID personality disorder.
right. I know I'm craving to reconnect with everyone.
Yeah.
And so we did this to share Janina's great ideas, but also to share that coming up in March is the 45th annual Psychotherapy Networker Symposium. This is sort of our field's family reunion, if you will. And for many
Absolutely.
therapists, it's like a pilgrimage. It's a place you go to just feel restored, refreshed, re-inspired. You're not going because we're just focusing on a particular approach. We're here to bring. We seek every year to bring the top experts, whether you're cognitive behavioral or more somatic based. If you're an addiction specialist or a family therapist, we want to get us all to the table, talking to one another and mixing ideas. And this is really the place where you kind of come and you leave with, hopefully, all notebooks full of sort of new ideas from speakers that you've heard of, who are really well known and famous, as well as some we've identified we think have just extremely interesting ideas that we want to put on the stage. So want to encourage you, if you can, join us in DC, or we'll be broadcasting from DC anywhere in the world. And should be a really, really good time. I hope you all show up. Thank you all for joining it. We have someone from Ireland here. So
it's wonderful.
Thank you for letting us pop up in your social feed. Janina, thank you for being here, and we'll talk to you all very soon.
Can't wait to see you all in DC.
I'll see you there.